She was 34 years old, and she had nothing left in this world but $12, a worn canvas satchel, and a red-coated hound named Copper, who slept pressed against her ribs every night, as if he feared she might disappear before morning. Her name was Nora Meade, and the people of Caldwell Crossing, Wyoming, a town that had once folded its arms around her family like a prayer, had watched in careful silence as Judge Harlan Price stripped her late father's estate down to the studs, claiming unpaid debts that no one alive could verify and no paper could prove. They had watched, and most of them had done nothing, because Judge Price was the kind of man whose shadow fell long and cold across the valley, and nobody in Caldwell Crossing was eager to stand in front of it. With her $12 and her dog and her satchel, Nora had walked through the town one last June morning, meaning to keep walking until she ran out of road. But then old Fen Schuler had flagged her down outside the feed store, and told her, almost as an aside, almost as a joke, that the Alderman Icehouse out on the edge of town was going for $11 if someone wanted the bother of it. It was abandoned. It was half sunken into the earth. The roof had bowed in summer heat, and the doors hung wrong on their iron hinges, and the whole structure smelled, people said, of rot and old river mud. Everyone in Caldwell Crossing had laughed when Nora Meade spent her last useful money on that crumbling, forgotten icehouse. They called it foolish. They called it desperate. They did not know, and neither did Nora, not yet, that sealed beneath the false pine floor of that icehouse lay something that had been waiting for the right person to find it for 22 years, something that would not merely save Nora Meade, but restore an entire community's stolen faith in itself. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora and her faithful dog Copper. If there is someone in your life who turned nothing into something, someone whose quiet tenacity still astonishes you, we would love to hear their story in the comments below. Nora had not always been the kind of woman who walked toward broken things. There had been a time, not so many years before, when the Meade household on the north end of Caldwell Crossing was considered one of the finest in Fremont County. Not because they were wealthy in the way the Price family was wealthy, with lawyers and ledgers and land deeds stacked to the ceiling, but because the Meades possessed a different kind of richness, the sort that lives in a household where everyone is fed and valued, and where the walls hold warmth even in January. Her father, Emmett Meade, had been a cabinet maker of some renown, trained by his own father in the workshops of Pittsburgh before the family moved west in the 1870s, and he had brought with him to Wyoming a reverence for wood that Nora absorbed the way a child absorbs language, not by being taught it exactly, but by breathing the same air as someone who already knows it deeply in the joints of his hands and the patient set of his shoulders. She had spent her girlhood in the workshop at the back of the house, watching Emmett read the grain of a board the way some men read scripture, his large rough hands running along the surface of pine or walnut or cherry until he could tell you, without measuring, where the wood wanted to go. He had taught Nora the same patience. He had taught her that nothing made of wood was ever truly finished. It was always moving, always settling, always speaking in the tiny creaks and shifts of its own slow language. He had shown her how a mortise joint could hold for a century if it was cut with care, and how a floor that looked solid could conceal an entirely different structure beneath it, if the builder had reasons for privacy. He taught her to see what others missed, to put her hand on a surface and feel for the seam, the hidden boundary between what was presented and what was real. She had not known, in those sawdust-hazed afternoons of her girlhood, that this particular lesson would one day save her. Her mother, Clara, had died of fever when Nora was 11, and after that, it was just the two of them in that house on the north end, and Emmett had doubled down on the lessons he believed his daughter would need. Not sewing or social graces, though Nora was perfectly capable of both, but the harder curriculum: how to read a contract before you signed it, how to tell a load-bearing wall from a decorative one, how to negotiate the price of lumber with a supplier who assumed a woman didn't know what anything cost. Clara would have approved, Emmett always said, his voice carrying both grief and conviction in equal parts. Clara had believed that knowledge was the only thing a person truly owned, the only inheritance that could not be taken by weather or fire, or a man with fraudulent paperwork and a friendly judge. Nora had grown into the workshop the way a good tree grows into its place, not by forcing itself upon the land, but by finding the direction of the light and the depth of the water, and moving toward both with quiet consistency. By her mid-20s, she was doing finishing work that customers drove from as far as Lander to commission, decorative carving and inlay work, so fine it seemed improbable that human hands had made it. She had a name for herself, a small but solid reputation, and the kind of local standing that comes from doing one thing exceptionally well, for long enough, that people stop being surprised by it and begin, instead, to count on it. She had plans, modest and sensible: expand the workshop, take on an apprentice, perhaps in another 5 years build a small showroom. The future felt, in those years, like a place she could see clearly from where she was standing. It was in the late spring of Nora's 28th year that a neighbor's dog delivered to their doorstep a litter of 4 puppies, having apparently decided that the Mead porch was an appropriate maternity ward. 3 of the puppies were taken in by other families within the week. The 4th, a red-coated male with oversized feet and one ear that stood slightly higher than the other, refused to leave. He followed Emmett to the workshop in the morning, and followed Nora to the market in the afternoon, and slept on the kitchen floor between their chairs at supper, and by the end of that first week, he had been named Copper, both for the warm rust red of his coat, and for the bright eager quality of his attention, which never seemed to dim. Copper had a particular fondness for Nora, that felt less like the easy affection of a well-fed house dog, and more like a deliberate choice, a loyalty he had arrived at through careful consideration, and then committed to entirely. He followed her everywhere. To the post office, to the dry goods store, along the creek bank on summer evenings where the cottonwoods hung their branches into the water, and the light came through in long gold columns, and the whole world had a quality of abundance that Nora would later learn not to take for granted. When she sat on the porch reading in the long western twilight, he would lay his head across her feet, with a sigh that sounded, she always thought, like contentment being exhaled slowly from the very center of his chest. She had told him things in those quiet hours, her plans, her worries, the small daily joys of a piece of work coming together properly, and he had received all of it, with the dignified attentiveness of a very good listener, who understands that presence is sometimes more important than response. The trouble arrived gradually enough, that by the time Nora understood it fully, it had already done most of its work. It began in the autumn of 1883, with what seemed like minor legal friction, a claim filed by the estate of a man named Whitfield, who had sold Emmett a parcel of timberland east of town some years earlier. Whitfield had died intestate, and his son, a pinched litigious creature named Dorsey Whitfield, who lived in Cheyenne, and had never once visited Caldwell Crossing in his life, had engaged the legal services of Judge Harlan Price to settle the estate, and specifically, to re-examine the timber deed that Emmett held. Price was not precisely a lawyer in the traditional sense. He held a partial legal credential, and a full judicial appointment, that had been obtained through means that the people of Caldwell Crossing had long suspected, but never been able to document, and his role in the county combined the functions of attorney, arbitrator, and occasional presiding officer, in ways that did not exactly violate the law as written, but violated entirely the spirit behind it. In the way these things worked in small Wyoming towns in that era, engaging Harlan Price meant something more than simply hiring a legal mind. It meant pulling a particular kind of lever, one that set a machinery in motion that was not visible to ordinary people, until it had already done most of its work. Emmett's timber deed, Price claimed, contained an irregularity of recorded title that rendered it invalid. The parcel, he argued, had never been properly transferred under territorial law. And beyond that, and this was the piece that landed in Nora's chest like a stone dropped into still water, Emmett Mead had, according to documents Price produced from some office in Cheyenne, borrowed against future timber earnings from a creditor whose name no one in Caldwell Crossing recognized, and that debt, compounded over the years at rates that strained the imagination, now exceeded the total value of the Mead property itself. Emmett had tried to fight it. He had hired what legal counsel he could find and afford, and the counsel had done what they could, but Price was well rooted in the county court system, and the documents he produced, however questionable their origin, carried the necessary stamps and signatures. The judge who presided over the case was, as many people privately suspected, a man who owed Harlan Price a debt he could only repay with favorable decisions. Nora had sat through the proceedings with her hands folded in her lap, and her face composed into an expression that communicated nothing, because she had understood from the first day that the courtroom was not the place where this was actually being decided. The decisions had been made elsewhere, in offices she had not been invited into, and what was happening in the courtroom was simply the public performance of a conclusion that had already been reached. She had watched her father's face during those days, and seen there, beneath his own careful composure, something wearing away. He grew quieter. He slept less. He moved through the workshop in the evenings with the slow distraction of a man who has had too much to carry for too long, and is only just now feeling the weight. Emmett died in the middle of the proceedings, a heart attack one February morning in his own workshop, slumped across the workbench where he had spent the better part of his life making beautiful and useful things. Nora found him at 7 in the morning when she came to open the shop, and Copper found him first, pressing his nose to Emmett's cold hand with a soft sound that Nora would carry in her memory always, a sound of recognition and sorrow combined into something she had no name for. She had sat for a long time in that workshop with her father and her dog, before she went to get anyone, because she wanted to give Emmett those last quiet minutes in the place he had loved best, surrounded by the smell of shavings and oil, and the particular silence of a well-made room. After that, things moved quickly in the way that legal proceedings move quickly when one party to them has died. Price filed new motions within the week. The estate, such as it was, became the object of immediate attachment. Nora had the workshop and the tools and a small amount of savings, and Price's filings moved to claim all of it, arguing that Emmett's documented debts transferred in full to his estate and therefore to his heir. The county court agreed, as Nora had known it would. By the following June she had nothing. The house was gone, the workshop was gone, her father's tools were in the custody of the county clerk, and Nora Meade was standing on the main street of Caldwell Crossing, with $12, a canvas satchel containing a change of clothes, and her mother's Bible, and Copper pressed against her left leg with the warm solidity of the one reliable thing remaining in the world. It was Fen Schuler who changed the trajectory of that particular morning, ambling out of the feed store with a tin of tobacco, and an expression of mild sheepishness, as though he knew he was about to say something that might sound like a joke, but wasn't quite. He told her about the Alderman Icehouse. Old Thaddeus Alderman had operated it for nearly 2 decades, as a commercial venture, cutting ice from the river each January, packing it in sawdust in the deep-walled storage chamber, and selling it through the warm months to households and businesses throughout the county. But Thaddeus had died without heirs in the winter of 1881, and the icehouse had sat empty ever since, its ownership tangled in a modest municipal dispute about town property lines that had taken years to resolve. The town had finally settled the deed, Fen said, and they were offering the building for $11 to anyone who would take it, mostly to get it off the civic accounts. Nobody had wanted it. It was old, it was halfway underground in the way icehouses had to be, and the interior had that smell, cold mixed with sawdust, and time, and something mineral and deep, that most people found unsettling even in daylight. Fen said all of this without quite looking at Nora, and she understood he was offering it not as a solution, but as a gesture of witness, a way of saying I see you, without having quite the courage to say it plainly. She walked to the town clerk's office that same afternoon, and paid her $11 to a small distracted man, who gave her a key on a length of jute twine, and a deed written in a cramped official hand, and wished her luck in a tone that suggested he thought she would need considerably more luck than any single human being could reasonably acquire. People watched her come out. She heard someone on the boardwalk say something to someone else, and then laugh, a short dismissive sound that carried in the dry summer air with surprising clarity. She did not look in the direction of the laugh. She tucked the deed into her satchel, put the key in her coat pocket, and walked with Copper at her side along the edge of town, toward the cottonwoods, and the low wide shape of the icehouse waiting in their shadow, and if she held her chin a particular way as she walked, it was a posture she had learned from her father, who had always said that the way a person carried themselves in the worst moments was the thing other people remembered longest. The icehouse sat at the far edge of town, where the land began to slope upward toward the hills, half embedded in the hillside in the manner of its kind, its thick walls, designed to hold the cold the way a fist holds something precious. The entrance was recessed and shadowed, the double doors hung slightly off true on their iron hinges, and the cottonwoods above had let their seed cotton drift, until it collected in the corners of the frame in soft white drifts. It looked, in the afternoon light, like something the town had been trying quietly to forget. Copper arrived at the threshold ahead of Nora, and stopped there, the way he sometimes stopped at the edge of the creek, to read the water before crossing, and he drew the air in through his nose, in 3 long deliberate pulls, his nostrils working with the focused intensity of a craftsman examining joinery. His tail, which was ordinarily the most expressive part of him, and rarely ever fully still, held perfectly motionless in a way that Nora found immediately remarkable. He stood there reading whatever the icehouse was saying to him, in its particular cold language of cedar, and mineral, and time, and then he looked back at her over his shoulder, with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not alarm, not simple curiosity, but something that lived between them, a compound of attention and urgency that said, plainly if you knew how to read it, that there was something here worth knowing. She pushed the doors open. The hinges gave a long low complaint, and the air that came out was cold, and dim, and carried that distinctive smell, river clay sealed from sunlight, old sawdust, and something beneath it both sweeter and stranger, as though the building had been marinating for years in its own particular history. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, as these structures often were, the primary storage chamber running deep into the hillside to take advantage of the earth's insulation. The walls were thick timber and brick, the floor was pine planking that had darkened with years of use and neglect, and the light that came through the open doors fell at a long angle across the space and illuminated the floating dust they had disturbed and the old runnels in the planking where the meltwater had once found its course to the drainage channel at the far wall. Copper stepped inside ahead of her and went directly to the center of the room, nose pointed at the floor, and stood there with that same fine trembling along his shoulders that seemed not like cold or agitation, but like the physical expression of something he was trying very hard to communicate. He was not a dog who performed for attention or fretted without cause. In 6 years of knowing him, Nora had learned to pay attention when he was telling her something. She crouched beside him and put her hand on his back and felt the trembling, steady and purposeful, and she looked at the floor where he was pointing his entire body, and she saw, at first, only old planking. Then she looked with her father's eyes, the eyes that had been trained to see the hidden seam, and she found it. The floor of the icehouse was laid in boards running east to west, close-fitted and dark with age. But in the center of the room there was a section, roughly 6 feet by 4, where the boards ran in the opposite direction, north to south. It was subtle. A person walking through in a hurry, or in dim light, with sawdust covering the planking, would not notice it, but the floor was clean now, from the air moving in through the open doors, and in the long afternoon light, the difference in direction was unmistakable to someone who had grown up learning to see what wood was doing beneath its surface. A false floor. Her father had shown her exactly this kind of construction once, in an old tavern they had passed through on a trip to Casper, pointing out a section of floor in the back room that didn't match, and telling her there had been some reason for it, once, and the building remembered even if the people had forgotten. She stood up slowly and looked at Copper, who was still looking at the floor with his ears at their most upright and attentive angle, and she felt in her chest a sensation she could not quite name, something between excitement and a deep, almost reverential patience, as though she understood, without knowing why, that whatever was beneath that floor had been waiting a long time to be found, and the least she could do was approach it with the care it deserved. There was a recessed iron ring she had initially taken, from a distance, for a drain fitting, set flush with the boards, unobtrusive, the kind of detail that only presented itself when you were looking for it. She worked her thumbnail under the edge of it, and felt it lift on a small pivot, and she got her fingers beneath it, and pulled and felt the hidden section of floor rise smoothly on a concealed hinge, far more smoothly than anything in the rest of the building, which told her that this mechanism had been maintained even in the years since Thaddeus Alderman's death, which meant someone else had known about it, or perhaps Thaddeus himself had oiled the hinge in his final days, preparing for a discovery he would not live to witness. The compartment that was revealed was roughly 18 inches deep and lined in fitted cedar, dry and clean and smelling of the cedar's own preservative oils in a way that told her the wood had been doing its work faithfully all the years since it was sealed. On a shelf of fitted cedar slats sat 12 document cases, each one bound in oilcloth and sealed with brass clasps, each one marked in a careful and deliberate hand with a date range. The earliest read 1863, 1865. The latest read 1878, 1879. They were arranged in chronological order. Whoever had placed them here had expected them to be read. Copper put his front paws on the edge of the compartment, and looked in, and then looked at Nora, and she could have sworn, would have sworn, in fact, for the rest of her life, that what she saw on his face was something very close to satisfaction. She carried all 12 cases to a dry corner of the icehouse, and sat with them in the remaining afternoon light, and the long blue summer dusk that followed it, and she read. Copper slept against her knee, and she read into the night by the light of the single candle she had in her satchel, reading the careful handwriting of a man she had never met. A man named Thaddeus Martin Alderman, who had kept records the way her father kept wood, with patience and precision, and the deep understanding that the quality of the keeping was itself a form of respect for what was being kept. The first case contained letters, financial ledgers, and personal correspondence. The second case held copies of contracts, land deeds, loan agreements, legal filings. By the time she reached the fourth case, her hands had begun to move less quickly through the pages, because she had begun to understand what she was looking at, and the understanding required a kind of steadiness that did not come naturally at that hour, in that cold dim room, with her father's name appearing in the documents before her, in the handwriting of the man who had destroyed him. Harlan Price's name appeared throughout. His distinctive slanted script appeared in letters discussing arrangements with county officials, transactions with Cheyenne creditors, strategies for the acquisition of properties whose owners could not be expected to mount effective legal resistance. There were names of men who held positions in the county court. There were references to a sympathetic territorial official who could be counted on in certain situations, and at the center of all of it, tying everything together like the load-bearing joint in a complex piece of furniture, was a system Price had developed over nearly 2 decades. The identification of landholders with vulnerable titles or modest legal resources, the fabrication or procurement of debt claims against them from creditors who either did not exist or who had agreed to split any proceeds, and the filing of those claims through county courts, where Price had cultivated relationships sufficient to ensure favorable outcomes. The Meade estate appeared in the 4th case, as she had known by then that it would. A letter dated 3 full years before Emmett's legal troubles began, written in Price's slanted hand, discussed the Meade timber parcel in the language of a man identifying a future acquisition. The letter noted that Emmett Meade was a craftsman without legal sophistication, that his title contained a minor irregularity that could be enlarged into something actionable with the right assistance from the county records office, and that the timber land itself, once acquired, could be sold to a logging concern in Cheyenne at a price that would make the effort worthwhile. It was written with the casual confidence of a man who had done this many times, and expected to do it many times more. Nora held that letter and read it 3 times, and then set it carefully aside, and did not move for a long moment. Copper woke at some point in that stillness, and put his head in her lap, and she laid her hand on the broad warm plane of his skull, and the weight of him there, warm and solid, and entirely without complication, was the thing that kept the stillness from becoming something worse. Thaddeus Alderman, she pieced together from the later cases, had been Price's original partner in these arrangements, or at least a knowing participant, who had provided certain services in exchange for certain considerations. But something had changed between them in the late 1870s, the evidence of which was visible in the correspondence, as a gradual cooling, a withdrawal, a shift in Thaddeus's tone from that of an ally to something more cautious, and then, in the final letters, something almost confessional. There was a document in the 11th case, undated but placed in a 1879 sleeve, that appeared to be a personal statement written in Thaddeus's own hand, not addressed to anyone, not a letter, more like a reckoning, written in the manner of a man trying to settle his accounts with himself before the end of his life. He wrote that he had told himself for many years that what Price was doing was merely legal maneuvering, and that his own participation had been peripheral, but that he had come to understand in his old age that peripheral participation in a harm was still participation, and that the harm done to families throughout Fremont County by the systematic theft of their land was real and lasting, and did not diminish with time or with the distance he had tried to put between himself and the memory of it. He could not undo what had been done. He could not, in his diminished state, fight Price directly, who had by then grown far more powerful than the man Thaddeus had first met. What he could do was keep the record. What he could do was put it somewhere safe, and trust that it would find its way, eventually, to someone who would know what to do with it. He had put it in the Icehouse, because the Icehouse was the one place Price would never purchase. It was too public, too associated with Thaddeus, too visible a piece of local infrastructure. And when the town took the property into its civic accounts after Thaddeus's death, Price would have no reason to pursue it. It was worth nothing to him. He needed it to be worth nothing. He needed it to stay worth nothing. He had not reckoned with a woman who had nothing left and $11, or with the dog who could smell the difference between old sawdust and something sealed beneath it. She was still reading, still cross-referencing the 11th case against the 3rd and the 7th, building in her mind the architecture of what had happened across 2 decades of carefully documented crime, when the floorboards near the entrance creaked beneath a heavy step, and Copper was on his feet before Nora had fully registered the sound, placing himself between her and the door with a steadiness that was not aggression, but was very clearly also not negotiable. The man who stepped into the Icehouse was Ward Price, the judge's nephew, who managed his uncle's various interests throughout the county, and who was known in Caldwell Crossing as someone who delivered unpleasant messages with a pleasant face. He was a large man, broad in the shoulder, with the kind of good looks that wear well into middle age if the person inside them is worth the exterior, which Ward was not. He stood in the doorway and looked at Nora, and at the open compartment, and at the document cases spread around her, with an expression that moved through surprise, through something harder, and then into a careful performance of friendliness that Nora recognized as the most dangerous of the three. He said she had stumbled onto something interesting. He said his uncle would very much appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation, that there might be compensation available, that certain misunderstandings from recent years might be revisited if parties could meet with goodwill on both sides. He had the smooth delivery of a man who had offered this particular category of proposition before, and found it effective. Copper had not looked away from Ward Price since the moment he entered. He did not growl, he did not move toward him. He simply stood at his chosen position, and held the man in his gaze with the kind of absolute, unblinking attention that tends to make people aware of exactly how much physical space they are taking up, and what that space means to a dog who has decided something about it. Ward Price shifted his weight. He glanced at Copper, and then back at Nora, and then at Copper again, and something in the pleasant presentation he had arrived with began, incrementally, to slip. Nora told him, in a voice that was steady, because she had decided it would be, that she had spent 2 full days reading the documents and understood their contents thoroughly. She told him she had already prepared a letter for a newspaper editor in Cheyenne, who had a documented interest in land fraud cases across the territory. She told him she intended to travel to Lander the following day, to present the material to the district court. She had not yet written the letter. She intended to write it that evening. But she had learned from 6 years of workshop negotiations that the most powerful thing in any difficult conversation was letting the other party understand clearly, and specifically, how much ground you were already standing on. And she had considerable ground now, 12 cases of it, and she was standing on every inch. Ward Price looked at Copper one last time, and then left without another word, and his footsteps across the packed earth outside were moving considerably faster than the footsteps that had brought him in. Nora listened to them fade, and then she sat back down with the documents, and Copper came and leaned against her shoulder, and she let him, and for a few minutes, they were simply two creatures who had come through something together, sitting in the cold and the dark of an old building that had been keeping secrets for 22 years. She did not sleep that night. She worked by candlelight until dawn, organizing the 12 cases into a coherent sequence, writing an index on the blank backs of old alderman receipts she found in a crate near the wall, building a framework that would allow someone unfamiliar with the documents to navigate their contents without becoming lost in the volume of it. She was doing what her father had always done with a complex piece of work, breaking it into its components, understanding how each piece related to the others, seeing the underlying structure before the surface was applied. At first light she walked to the home of Ardis Fulton, who had been Emmett's oldest friend in Caldwell Crossing, and who Nora trusted with the kind of unconditional certainty that comes only from knowing someone across a full span of time and difficulty. Ardis was 71 years old, and had outlasted 3 husbands and a house fire, and possessed the constitutionally steady temperament of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by the worst things people could do, and was therefore capable of responding to them clearly, without the paralysis of shock. She listened to Nora for an hour without interrupting. Then she said she had a cousin who was a clerk of court in Lander, and she would ride there herself, and they would know exactly what to do. She also said, looking at Copper, who had followed Nora to the Fulton porch, and was sitting on the top step with the patient air of a dog, who understands that important things are being decided, and that his role in this particular moment is to wait. She said that she had always believed dogs were better judges of situations than people generally acknowledged, and that if Copper had pointed Nora toward those documents, she was inclined to think well of Nora's chances. What followed took months, because justice in Wyoming in that era was not built for speed, and Harlan Price had resources and allies that did not evaporate overnight. But the documents in Thaddeus Alderman's Icehouse were extraordinary in their completeness, and the district court in Lander was not the county court that Price had spent decades cultivating, and the newspaper editor in Cheyenne arrived in Caldwell Crossing and spent a full week reading through the cases, and came away with enough material for a series of articles that created the kind of sustained public attention that even the most entrenched man of influence finds difficult to operate beneath. The county officials named in the documents had varying responses that ranged from cooperation to denial, but the paper trail was thorough, and the district court was methodical, and in the end the accounting was done. 6 properties seized through fabricated debt claims were identified and subjected to title review. 4 of them were ordered restored to their original owners or their heirs. The Meade property was one of the 4. Ward Price, facing charges of his own, chose cooperation. Harlan Price himself was stripped of his legal credential and faced criminal proceedings that resulted in fines, supervised restriction, and the effective termination of his influence in Fremont County. Many people felt the penalty was not commensurate with the harm. Nora was among them, and she held that feeling quietly, the way she held most things that were too large and complicated to do anything useful with. And she kept moving. The Meade property came back to her in October, on a morning when the cottonwoods had gone gold, and the sky over Caldwell Crossing was that particular deep autumn blue that appears in Wyoming for only a few weeks, and makes everything beneath it look simultaneously ordinary and somehow sacred. She stood in the yard with Copper at her side, and put her hand on the doorframe of her father's workshop. The smell of it, linseed oil and pine shavings, and the particular dusty warmth of a room that had been used for real work, came at her all at once, and she stood with it for a moment, without trying to make it into anything other than what it was. Copper pressed himself against her leg, and she reached down and scratched behind his good ear, the one that stood perfectly straight, and he exhaled with that long slow sigh she had loved since the first week of his life with her, the sigh that meant he was exactly where he was supposed to be, and so was she. She repaired the icehouse that winter with her own hands, using her father's tools and her father's methods, and by the following spring, she had established it as a working cold storage business, serving the households and restaurants and small enterprises of Caldwell Crossing. It was not a grand undertaking. It required early mornings and cold hands, and the kind of patient daily labor that does not attract much attention and is the richer for it. Several of the families whose properties had been restored became her first customers, and others followed, and the town that had watched in silence when she was stripped of everything, and had laughed when she spent her last money on an abandoned building, settled into a relationship with Nora Meade that had about it the quality of a community working carefully towards something, not quite reparation, because some harms cannot be repaired in the way a joint can be recut and refit, but something adjacent to it, a sustained, practical acknowledgement that she was there, and that she mattered, and that the icehouse she had saved was worth visiting regularly and paying fairly. People brought Copper treats from the butcher counter, which he accepted with the calm and equable dignity of a dog who has come to understand that the world, when it is paying attention, sometimes knows how to apologize without the precise words for it. And so we find ourselves returned to the place we began, to a main street in Caldwell Crossing on a June morning, and a woman walking toward the edge of town with $12 and a canvas satchel and a red-coated hound who had already decided, in the way that good dogs decide things, quietly and completely and with no particular need for the decision to be acknowledged, that wherever she was going was where he was going too. We described the laughter that followed her, and we should be honest, that laughter was real, and some of the people who laughed were not bad people, but merely people who had learned to measure worth by surfaces and prices and the opinions of those who held authority in their county, and those are not bad things exactly to measure by, but they are incomplete. They will tell you what something appears to be worth, and they will never tell you what is sealed beneath the floor. What Nora found in that icehouse was extraordinary in its specifics. The meticulous conscience of a man trying at the end of his life to put right what he had helped put wrong. Laid out in 12 oilcloth cases in a cedar-lined compartment beneath a false pine floor. But the truth it embodied was simple enough to fit in a single sentence. The overlooked things, the half-sunken things, the things that people have walked past for 22 years deciding are not worth a second look, they have a way of holding precisely what the world most needs to find. Thaddeus Alderman had known that the right pair of hands would come along eventually, that someone would arrive who had enough left to risk $11 and nothing left to lose by going in. He had trusted the building to wait, and the building had waited, and Copper had stood in the center of that floor, and trembled with the knowledge of what was beneath it, and Nora had crouched beside him, and put her hand on his back, and felt the trembling, and understood that it was time to look. We hope this story found you in a good moment today, and that if it moved you, you will consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear something like it. Perhaps someone who has lost more than seems survivable, or someone who is standing in front of a door that everyone else has already walked past. Nora and Copper remind us that what looks like a ruin sometimes has a floor beneath it worth lifting, and what looks like foolishness sometimes has the clearest instincts of all, and that the patient, faithful kind of love, the kind that shows up every morning and stays past dark, is the kind that history tends, in the end, to vindicate. What has been hidden always finds its way to the light. If this story reminded you of something, or someone, we would love to know. Until next time, stay close.